Today, we are privileged to have our first keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Jose Stelle. He is the writer of several books, including The China Lectures, Constitutional Reforms in China. This book was translated into many languages, including Thai language, in 2015. This book has been widely read by senior officers in Thailand. I would now like to invite Professor Dr. Jose Stelle to deliver his keynote speech on rule of law and good constitution as foundation for nation building. Please welcome Professor Dr. Jose Stelle.
Thank you all for coming. I would like to start by wishing health and happiness to His Majesty the King and his family, and also the Prime Minister and all the members of the Thai government and of the armed forces whose discharge of their responsibilities enhances the freedom and overall stability of this great country and of its disciplined and gentle people. I also wish to thank Professor Charyun Wongsak and his assistants for the great work they have done, the many hours they put in to organize this conference. Our subject today is complex, so we can touch on only a few points, and even then superficially. But I hope that the lecture will provide fruitful elements of thought for fruitful discussion later on. So this will be mostly a theoretical speech. I am a philosopher, I'm not a policy person, and had great difficulty in one foundation trying to write policy and couldn't because of my philosophical bent. I will suggest more specific ideas and policies later on in my other two lectures. When I was university students, my professors used to say that I was a stickler for detail. And following along that line, as a university professor, I have taught only basic definitional subjects, fundamentals, interpretations, and so forth. So I ask your indulgence if I trouble you with definitions, fundamentals, and interpretations in some depth. I do this because I think that they will help to clarify the main subject of discussion. Slide one, please. Who's taking care of the slides here? Oh, okay. And two. When we look at the situation in the world today, and especially in those countries that pride themselves in being at the forefront of politics and economics, we notice that there's something lacking, that some sort of shift has occurred over time. And I believe that this has created a critical situation, and it has to do with the collapse of principles of human conduct: respect, liberality, tolerance, freedom, friendship, civility. If you look at what's happening in the United States today on TV, in Congress, in the White House, in the UK, is there anything more troubling than to watch a session of the House of Commons attacking the Prime Minister? I don't think so. In American university campuses, and of course in other countries sometimes, students get together and form a sort of paramilitary group and will not let some people speak let's say, invited speakers, I would probably not be allowed to speak on most American campuses today. They would think that what I say is not appropriate. And this is the situation that we have in the world, and especially in these countries. I propose that the situation can be corrected by a strict application of the rule of law, which is a much deeper concept than we normally realize, and that sometimes has what would be regarded as unpleasant consequences, but they are necessary. Now, constitutionalism, constitutional government, was developed in order to protect, as the English used to say, freedom under law. And I would like to say under law because there is no political freedom outside the law. And to promote, of course, good government, the integrity of the state, and all these things that other speakers before me have talked about as the goal of politics. Now, these problems existed also in ancient times, and we can learn from them. For example, this would be slide 5. In the first year of the Peloponnesian War, it was a critical situation. And the Athenian leader, Pericles, spoke of the importance of Solon's constitution, which had been promulgated about 150 years before. And so he said, what was the road by which we have reached our position? What was the form of government under which our greatness grew? And we could actually even say, what is the form of government under which Thailand can progress and become great, or greater than it is? What were the national habits out of which it sprang? And then he answered this way. He said, if we look to the laws, we are on slide 5 here. If we look to the laws, we see that they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. Now, our lecture will develop in the following way. We can actually, because of time constraints, let's go and skip to slide number 9, please. So, if the solution is the rule of law, we have to have a definition, and the authoritative exposition that we have in constitutional thought was given by A.V. Dicey, the British jurist of the late 19th century. And he said, the rule of law means the absolute supremacy and predominance of regular law as opposed to the influence of arbitrary power. He does not mean power, he meant arbitrary power. And exclude the existence of arbitrariness and even of wide discretionary authority on the part of the government. And again, the emphasis on discretionary, not on duly constituted authority. This is something that sometimes gets forgotten, especially under the influence of some forms of thinking. Now, Montesquieu and the creators of the American Constitution thought that the rule of law would be implemented best through the separation of powers. So there is a horizontal separation, there's a vertical separation. The horizontal separation is between the three powers, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary power, and vertically through the provinces and the cities through federalism, meaning that they have their own, they may have their own constitutions and their own laws, but that those laws still have to conform to the basic law of the Constitution. So that would be a vertical. And the combination of this horizontal application of the law and the separation of powers and the vertical one would produce good results. I would like to mention in passing, this is number 10 here, I would like to mention in passing a book by Konrad Hesse, the German jurist who passed away some time ago. He wrote a very interesting essay, very informative essay, a very powerful essay, which is produced in a little booklet, and it's called The Normative Power of the Constitution. As far as I know, outside of Germany, it's only been translated in Brazil. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but I highly recommend it to those interested in these subjects that they examine this normative power of the Constitution by Konrad Hesse. Now, we're talking about Constitution. I don't know what the translation will be in your language, but in the English language and in the Latin languages, it comes from the old Latin, the old Roman language, and it means to stand together. Con means together or with, and statuere means to stand or to make stand. That's why we have the word, for example, statute, which is something that stands, right? And the goal of constitutionalism, then, is to help the people stand together as a nation, as a people, to promote social harmony, good government, and a good, strong, and duly constituted state. Now, Edmund Burke, the British thinker of the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th, added a philosophical, metaphysical dimension to the constitutional idea, which is very interesting, and that I'm sure the people of Thailand will understand. And he said that the Constitution connects the generations, past, present, and future, giving stability to the nation over the centuries. So a Constitution is a conservative document. It attempts to preserve certain ways of acting, certain ways of behaving, certain ways of treating other people. Now, if we talk about the concept of the rule of law, we have to define, obviously, what law is. Now, Hayek, in his book, The Constitution of Liberty, pays homage to Kant, the German philosopher, and says, he said that, and this is Kant's idea, of course, affirmed by Hayek. He says, law is not any rule, just any rule, the legislator or anybody wishes to write or to impose. To be law, a rule must contain certain principles. In other words, it must not be arbitrary. It must be general, which means it must be equally applicable to all. And to be general, it must be stated in abstract terms. And we are at slide 12. In sum, the law must be applicable to all persons, from the highest public authority to the poorest peasant. So a legal rule cannot name or discriminate specific persons. Obviously, if the rule is only referring to women, or let's say, or to children, as Rousseau himself mentioned, then of course it will discriminate, quote unquote, mentioning only those people. But still, under that environment, it's still equally applicable to all, right? It must state in general terms what will be required of all persons under its protection, anywhere, at any time. There are no exceptions and no privileges. And we'll talk about privilege in a minute. And we have this wise comment by Alfred Marshall, the British economist of the late 19th century, who says that where small privileges exist, some modifications in the law to create certain things, for example, aid to the poor, it should be temporary and not renewable in order not to create constituencies and a place where politicians might go hunting for votes in order to overturn the system. Now, privilege, from the Latin privilegius, which means private law as opposed to general public law. Right? There are pseudo-laws, official rules that favor one group or one person over another, bureaucratic manipulations that allow, or habits that allow public servants to favor certain persons, to extort bribes or things of that nature. for any purpose, right? And in the case, for example, of industrial regulation, in the United States, it's very well known that through the political system, which is failing and has failed for a long time, the regulated end up by bribing the politicians and having connections with the bureaucracy, they can actually become the regulators of themselves. James Madison, the founder, in a sense, of the United States, the creator of the Constitution, and a man who fought valiantly to have this document approved because the organized interests were getting together and trying not to approve it. He said that the legislatures must include themselves, their friends and relatives in the law. They cannot be excluded from the law. Because if we have then that sort of approach in which they do not forget themselves and their friends as they write the law, then we will have good government and good laws. Now, privilege, takes many forms, and its practitioners are very creative. It's the sort of thing that we feel all the time, and it can take very elegant ways so that we can hardly see it's happening, and it can take inelegant ways in which we feel a real sense of injustice. But it's happening anyway. It can happen. Now, the political instability. Hayek, after studying, initially he was in favor of constitutionalism, for example, of the United States and the United Kingdom, as it was, this was around 1960. He felt that those governments were still okay, pretty much acceptable. By 1979, he had come to the conclusion that constitutionalism had failed, not because it attempted to reach the rule of law, but because it had been prevented from doing that. And the main element of this destruction, this downgrading of the political system of constitutionalism, is this element that was allowed into the Constitution called democracy, or the democratic process. It was through the introduction of the democratic process and elections that gradually things began to collapse. I mean, not even gradually. You can see it already in the first administration of George Washington, how the special interests were organizing themselves into parties in order to basically control the government. And so we have, for example, today, Hayek points out, that in current practice, we are being, in those so-called Western democracies, we're being governed by administrative law, and the idea of administrative law and presidential regulations, rather than by the Constitution and the rule of law itself. At least partially that's happening, and that is one of the problems of these countries. So in current practice, then, he says, the great majority of the so-called laws regulating the relations between private persons and between private persons and the government are actually instructions issued by the state to its servants concerning administrative matters, and they really do not have the quality of law. The result is what we call governmental drift. You can see that the government doesn't have stability. It's always shifting around. And the ship of state is tossed about according to elections, and it does not have the stability that it should have. Now, if you know the history of Roman Republic, how gradually the law collapsed and the Republic turned into empire, and the empire exhausted itself with taxation to the point where it confiscated all the properties of everybody in order to pay its bills. And people became the serfs of the Middle Ages, right? Those serfs of the Middle Ages were initially Roman citizens who had lost their properties and everything they had because of overtaxation. Everything went to the government, and then the government itself could not sustain itself, and the barbarians invaded. They were freer than the Romans themselves. And even the Romans went over to the side of the barbarians because they had a freer life with the barbarians. So, this reduction of general civil laws to administrative status is the main problem of the United States, France, England, Germany, and all these countries. Right? And this threatens the logic of constitutionalism, the logic of the rule of law, and the very future of these nations. You know. Many things that are happening in Europe and the United States, Canada, and other places, certainly Latin America, you can see it is a result of this disappearance, this gradual disappearance of the rule of law. If you watch the situation that's taking place, for example, in Brazil today, that's the country I originally am from, you notice there's a tremendous battle going on there to establish the rule of law and put an end to corruption, which has reached such proportions as has never been seen probably in the history of Latin America. And so Hayek says that the rule of law cannot be understood and implemented outside a deep comprehension of its dual nature as general laws and appropriate regulations, right? Which may, if they're not appropriate, then they are possibly illegitimate. They include positive regulation in the sense of attempting to control the outcomes of actions rather than to simply create conditions for everybody to participate in the economy. And we call that interventionism, the wrong kind of interventionism, and administrative law. And of course, the objective of the rule of law is the opposite. It's to cut the link between privilege and legislation. Now, my emphasis here on general rules as opposed to administrative rules does not mean that administrative rules and regulations should not exist. On the contrary, they should. There should be good regulations, and those are the ones that help the market and help the functioning of society. And there are bad regulations which actually impede the market from working and create tensions and all sorts of problems within society, conflicts of all sorts. If you see people demonstrating in the streets, very likely there's some problem in the law, some kind of conflict that is inherent in the way the laws are being written or not written. And the interventions should be, they're good interventions, of course, and those are the ones that should seek to eliminate force and fraud and all sorts of human relations, right? And the defense of, they protect persons and property. So there are good regulations, there are good interventions, and there are bad regulations and bad interventions. And the objective of the rule of law is to create then a level playing field in which everybody has a chance to play the game and compete, but not to have a guaranteed medal. As Hayek says, competition is a discovery procedure. We don't know who's going to win the election. We don't know who's going to win the Olympics. That's why we have the Olympics. It's always a surprise, right? We need the Olympics in order to find out. And the Olympics, of course, in the economic field is the market, right? I mean a duly regulated market, right? So economic regulation should help the normal functioning of the economy by preventing force and fraud in market transactions, not to help particular persons or groups. We are at slide 18. I'm moving a little faster here. Now, in all of this, we have this question of democracy. The Constitution of Thailand, recently approved, begins by saying that this is a democratic country with the king as head of state. As I read the Constitution, I notice that it does not mean democratic in the sense of elections and then you get elected and you do what you want. It actually means, and I've asked one person here in Thailand, what do you mean by democratic? And this person said, and this is a student, a master's degree student, he said, well, I understand democracy means that there's equality for all under the law. Right? that nobody should have discrimination against them in the law. And this is how he interpreted democracy. It's obviously not what politicians talk about in the United States. I heard, I was watching TV the other day, and there was this French politician or scholar, I forget what, and he talked about democracy for about 5 minutes in his interview. And after 5 minutes, I had no idea of what he meant by democracy. Maybe he didn't know, maybe he was hiding something. He had some ulterior motive in promoting that, right? So, let's go to the definitions here. And I would like to remind you here that Marx, the so-called father of communism, believed that democracy and socialism were pretty much the same thing. So I think this is something to think about. Of course, he was defining democracy in a different way from the way I would define it. In number 19, in the United States, there's great confusion about democracy. I don't believe that this confusion came about accidentally. I think it was promoted. And you can actually see the points at which it was promoted and who was behind it. There was an attempt to fool the people and change their way of thinking about it in some particular way. So in the United States we have today, everybody talks about our democracy, including the conservative judges of the Supreme Court who should absolutely know better. But they go along with it to common speech. Instead of our republic, our constitutional system, which is how you would talk about in the 19th century, even until about maybe 1930, the word republic has disappeared from the textbooks, from discussions, from political science, and from every place. Right? In the classrooms, nobody talks about it. And even the United States has a foundation for defense of democracies, which of course is not democracy in the sense of absolute power by the vote, but in the sense of constitutional government. Now, constitutional government is not democracy, as I will try to say here and explain in a minute. And so what most people mean by democracy is constitutional government. That is really what they mean, right? I can see my friends in Brazil when they say that we need to defend democracy against this tyrannical government or this very corrupt government. What they mean is they want a constitutional government. They want the rule of law. But that is not exactly what democracy is. Right? So let's turn to Schumpeter, who made a study of this in his book of 1942, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Scientifically, he says, he was trying to be scientific, not philosophical. I tried to be philosophical, but let me follow him scientifically. He says, democracy is only a method for determining who has won an election. It has no constitutional competence, it has no constitutional qualities or power. And this, of course, is in, all right, is it, sound is not strong enough? And this, of course, is, he was following Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, the father of political science, who said the same thing about democracy in his own days, that democracy is not a constitution because its rules are not equally applicable to all. They're only applicable to the majority that actually voted for the particular party. Now, an election, says Schumpeter, changes the government. It creates a new leader. But it doesn't tell us whether it's going to be good government and whether it's going to be a good leader. Whether they are honest people or dishonest people who want to use the governmental machinery to promote themselves. And he says something that's very interesting that I'd like you to consider and to remember, which is that this good idea that people have of democracy. If you ask anybody in any classroom or any person or group in the United States today, for example, or in Brazil or in Europe, do you want democracy? They'll say yes, right? And this is what Schumpeter says about that. He says, the good opinion that people have of democracy comes from the fact that up to now, democracy has worked under a constitutional form. If you eliminated the constitutional form, it would produce chaos and pretty soon tyranny, as the French discovered during their revolution. They ended up with 40,000 people dead with their heads cut off, and because of democratic thinking. And he also says something interesting, which is that once you have majority rule without any constitutional restraints, then anything goes. In Rome, the Christians were persecuted and killed because the majority of the people approved of it. They thought it was correct. In Calvin's republic in Switzerland in the mid-16th century, people were burned at the stake because they were accused of being witches or they were heretics. They rejected the religion or something like that. And in Salem, Massachusetts, in the United States, in the colonial times, last stages of the colonial times, well, not stages, actually about halfway, something like 19 girls and 3 adults were either hanged or crushed under stones because it was thought that they possessed evil spirits in them, or they were witches or something. And again, it happened because the people, and the majority of the people there, thought that this was the correct way to solve the problem. So Schumpeter is giving us a warning here about what kind of outlines democracy may actually take if it's not properly watched and severely disciplined by constitutional rules, right? He mentions that, the famous American New England town meeting, which is considered a basis of beautiful democracy, or the Greek city where a certain number of people, with many exclusions, of course, would get together and decide what to do by majority vote. The things that happen in those assemblies are not always pretty. There wasn't always agreement, and sometimes people got hurt and were even expelled from the society and told to go away. So we have a problem here. Now, what if, for example, if our small town meeting, and even a small condominium meeting has this problem in which there is no agreement. You would think that 8 or 10 or 12 people in a condominium meeting would agree on things. Well, they don't, right? So can the country then, so if our small condominium in our small town becomes the nation of 100 million people, let's say, are we going to use democracy and have a referendum every day about everything that's going on that needs to be done? No. And so we need representation. And that's when the problem begins. What kind of representation are we going to have? How are we going to do it, right? And we have elections, and then supposedly these elected people will go over to the capital city, and they will compromise and talk and respect one another and trade favors or something, and then some stability will be brought to the system. Now, there is something that really must be clarified here, which is the question of in constitutional theory and in constitutional reality. You have the question of legislative prerogative and legislative sovereignty. Now, legislative prerogative means that in constitutional theory, the legislative power will make laws and review laws. But under democratic ideology, it tends to become unlimited democracy, sovereignty, right? Not the prerogative to write law, but the idea, as Hayek mentions, that destroyed the constitutional systems of the United States and England and others, which is the idea that it can do whatever it wants. And that is pretty much what we have today. if those of you who read my book will notice that at one point there I mentioned, I think right at the beginning, that in the United States today, the great majority of the people in Congress and Senate openly admit that when they're voting, they say, this is nothing, I'm not even thinking about the Constitution here. They actually admit this openly. And they take, it is interesting because they take an oath to protect and follow the Constitution before they start their terms of office. And yet, as soon as they give that oath, they start acting in ways that are unconstitutional and are even proud of it, especially among the Democratic Party. They proudly are against the Constitution, most of them. And they say so. And their professors in the universities, Yale, University of Texas, even have books that actually say that we should eliminate the Constitution and we should govern ourselves simply by, let's say, an election that has 55% majority. That should be considered a law, a new constitutional law. And the professor at the University of Texas wrote a book called Our Undemocratic Constitution, in which he basically says, when you really read the whole book, he's basically saying, let's put an end to the Constitution. It's over. We don't need it anymore. And that's what's going on in the United States. And these are some of the fundamental forces that are shaking that country, right? So, and Hayek says that Britain has given us two incompatible ideals. One is the ideal of the rule of law, and the other one is the idea of legislative sovereignty, the idea that Parliament can do anything it wants. This is something that developed in the mid-18th century and became the basis of the Declaratory Act, which basically said that England could do anything it wanted to the colonies in America, and that was the beginning of the American Revolution right there and then. That's when the Americans began to revolt. Right? So on principle, majority rule, unlimited democracy, legislative tyranny, as Hayek calls it, unrestricted privilege, this is one of the things that normally the democratic process will allow people to do. Now, the ideal of democracy is that we will all get together and we'll sit together, we're rational people, and we'll vote and decide, and because we discussed and we're rational and decided, whatever we decide is good, right? It's as if people did not have any evil in them. Everybody's just nice. But in reality, there is no such thing as democracy in the sense of everybody participating or everybody having some say-so in the system. What you have is the democratic process. What you have is elections and candidates and political parties. And that is something totally different. In fact, that destroys the very nature, this vague idea that people have of democracy as something positive that they would like to have, right? And victory at all costs, of course, is what it's all about. Now, there are two problems with, as Schumpeter mentioned. He says that the democratic process becomes, well, actually, I'm saying that. He does not say that. He simply implies it. Is that it becomes an attractive tool of the organized interest to take over the government. It's the means by which they invade the state, right? Let's say in the Western world. And they are an organized minority. They want to subvert the law, impose their will on the people's will, which supposedly this people's will is what supposedly the election was all about, right? But there's something even more basic than that, which is that even honest people who are the unorganized and unorganizable minority, even they will disagree, right? As I said, the condominium meeting does not produce 100% agreement. And I've been to many of those. My father, my late father, went to many of those, and always we came out feeling that we were robbed, that our wishes were not taken into account, right? And I actually think, for example, that some things may be agreed upon, or what the Americans call compromise. You give in, you give something in exchange for something, and you and everything in some sort of stability is achieved. I don't think that, some things there can be no agreement. I don't think that abortion will ever be a question of agreement. People always disagree on it. Even, for example, in the 1950s in the United States, there were people that were afraid that the government might put certain chemicals in the water in order to make the people more sleepy and more compliant and willing to do what the government wanted. There are people, for example, who don't want their babies or their children to be vaccinated, right? So what do we do with all these disagreements, right? And then, in order to assert itself, the democratic parties have to manufacture the will of the people. They are closer together, they know one another, they're a small group, and they have access to the media, and they can actually manufacture the will of the people. So that even this will of the people that's supposed to govern is to a large extent a result of manipulations during the campaign in order to produce a certain way of feeling and thinking and vote in a certain way, rather than rational argument and real understanding of what's happening, right? So electoral fraud, for example, is part of the deal. In the United States, even a dead vote, every now and then in elections, we find out that the dead in a certain state, in a certain city, actually voted. Who promoted this? Who got this to pass, right? Most states in the United States do not allow prisoners to vote. But if you're running for Congress in a district, and the difference will be, let's say, maybe 150 votes will get you elected, you can go down to the prison where there are 2,000 prisoners and promise them something, and if they're allowed to vote, you can actually win the election by catering to prisoners' wishes, right? And of course, as the ancient writers already knew, democracy produces demagogues, accomplished liars, deceivers of people. They show up immediately as soon as elections are announced. And they make false promises, wild accusations, they disrespect the other candidates, they speak evil of the other party, and so on and so forth. But there are other problems too that make the idea of democracy difficult to accept. Or at least this idea that democracy means we're going to vote and we're going to get what we want, right? It's the problem of communication. If you want to be a candidate, how are you going to, let's say that you want to run for the city council of Bangkok. How are you going to reach the 12 million people out there, or the 8 million voters, or whatever? You have no money, right? So you have to go to the people who have money. And I doubt that you will, and I know this because I attempted to run for the State Assembly of Florida once, and this is what I found out, is that unless you promise access, and I'm quoting here, this is what they wanted, access, and they wouldn't define what it is, access, but they said, we want access, otherwise we will not give you money. And so I had to quit my campaign. So in the end, okay, we have 3 more minutes. Okay. So in the end, the rich, actually, the big corporations, the labor unions, the medical associations, there's all sorts of people who get together as groups. They end up controlling the system. And so, as Plato himself said long time ago, 2,380 years ago, he said that democracy then leads initially to the government not of the people, but of the oligarchs, the rich, right, who manipulate the system from behind the scenes and make the people actually believe that they're really voting and that they're really controlling. But the control is not theirs, right? And Professor Russell Hardin of New York University, very wise, observant political scientist, He has studied the elections and the development of the political system of the United States, and he came to this conclusion in his book, Constitutionalism and Liberalism, Constitutionalism, and Democracy, in which he said that the United States has never been run by the people. It has always been run, it's always been controlled by the more active groups, those who act more strongly, who have more money, more power, and who are more intense in their campaigns, in the way they speak and promote things. They end up winning, not the people, right? So the idea of democracy then, basically of the democratic method, because democracy, as I say, does not exist, cannot exist, at least in the way people think about it. And so the objective is not to inform the people so that they will vote rationally and really understand the problems that they're facing, but to manipulate the people. Then there are other problems, of course, is that the Constitution does not limit, the United States Constitution does not limit, for example, no Constitution that I know of limits terms in office. So they want to be there, in one case in the United States, House of Representatives, 52 years. Senate, 56 years. Senate, 36 years. Senate, 36 years. Right? And as Senator Robert Dole, after 36 years in the Senate, said when he finally quit after 36 years, he was asked by a reporter, what's the best thing that happens to you now that you are no longer in the Senate? He says, the best thing is that I no longer have to lie. That's really a very sad comment, but it's a true one. Right? And the idea of popular participation then is highly overrated, as Professor Hardin says. And reality says what you have is popular acquiescence. Okay? It means that people are tired, they're busy, they're running around trying to support their families, and they give up the fight. They accept the government they get, even though they don't like it. And recent research shows that the people vote or support, not that they vote for parties and people, not because they understand the policies or anything like that, but because they like the candidate, right? They like the speech or the way he dresses or his hair or her intensity or something, or her promises or something. So they follow a leader. Now, is that a good leader or a bad leader, right? So, President Abraham Lincoln said that you can fool the people some of the time, but you cannot fool the people all of the time. If we go by what I've just said, yes, you can fool the people all the time. I have one example here. Candidate Barack Obama made many promises. So when he was elected, became the president-elect, he gave the first interview with the press. And so one reporter asked, you promised many things. Are you going to accomplish them? Are you going to carry out those promises? He said, oh no, I just said that in order to get elected. Now it's a totally different ball game. So I'm not totally finished with my lecture, but I leave it there because of lack of time for you as something to think about as things are, moving along here in Thailand towards some kind of election system. I have many ideas, which I cannot explain right now because I don't have the time, but you're willing to, if you're willing to talk about it some other time, I have some very good suggestions for how to control this democratic system and achieve the rule of law without having some of these negative elements that we have in the Western democracies and that are so painful to the point that only 50% of the Americans today vote. The rest of the population is, as they say, sick and tired of the system, and they don't go to the polls anymore because they say it makes no difference. I vote, but nothing changes. So something is severely wrong with that great nation. Thank you very much.